Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. I'm Jennifer Rubin, and I'm president of the League of Women Voters of Orange, Durham, and Chatham counties. And we're thrilled that you're with us this evening. As you all know, the League of Women Voters is all about protecting voters' rights and making sure that citizens' voices are heard. And if we ever needed a reminder of how important that is, all we have to do is look at the activities that have taken place in the legislature today and in the courts last week. Really all this week hasn't been a great week for voters. So that's why it's even more important that we understand all the mechanisms that are available to help citizens' voices be heard, which brings us to tonight's program we're very excited about. So with that, I will introduce Ann Triolzi, who is the manager of the Democracy Series and a member of the board of directors for us. So again, thank you for coming.
Thank you, Jennifer. We're going to ask that everyone put their questions in the chat, and Ellen Reckow, who is also a member of the board, will go through those questions at the end of the presentation. Tonight's event is being recorded and will be available in the next week on our website, lwvodc.org, in the Learning Center, along with a report prepared by students in the Master of Public Policy program at Duke University. You can go to the next slide. We're holding the 9th presentation in our local league's State of Our Democracy lecture series. This series started 2 years ago after the events of January 6th. We decided it is important to take a closer look at what it means to have a democracy, determine how secure it really is, and to do our part, not only to support it, but to help it thrive. To that end, tonight, we look at what it means when state citizens have direct power to ensure their government is governing the way they would like. Citizen initiatives allow a state citizen to place specific legislative acts on the ballot and that are then voted on. The next slide. We're pleased to have Asher Hildebrand speak to us about this topic. Asher served for nearly 15 years in Congress and on political campaigns, holding senior leadership roles as Chief of Staff to Representative David Price and as Director of Policy and Research for President Obama's 2012 campaign in North Carolina. He holds an MPA from the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs and a BA from UNC Chapel Hill. He currently is an associate professor of the practice, teaching courses on politics and policy analysis in the Sanford School's Master of Public Policy program at Duke University. He also leads seminars on legislative advocacy and current threats to American democracy. His academic interests include American politics, legislative institutions, civic participation and advocacy, democracy reform, and U.S. foreign policy. Before I hand it over to Asher, I also want to add that we're excited to have the benefit of research conducted by students in the Master of Public Policy program at Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy. The research looks at designing a citizen initiative process specifically for North Carolina. So Asher, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ann and Jennifer, and to everybody on this call. We'll share my screen in just a second, but want to start just by acknowledging the obvious, which is that it's been a heck of a week in North Carolina politics between the state Supreme Court rulings last Friday and the events of the last 48 hours in the General Assembly. My guess is that a lot of you are probably feeling fairly despondent, outraged right now, and that some of you may even have been spending your time down on Jones Street the last couple of days and that there are probably others who would be here with us tonight if they weren't totally exhausted by that. And with all of that going on, just want to acknowledge that it perhaps feels a little quaint to be talking about something that has a pretty slim chance of coming to our state anytime soon. I said before people started joining this call, this is either a great time to be having this conversation or a terrible time to be having it. But I think it could be a great time too, because as Jennifer said, it's also at times like this that really demand that we think broadly and creatively about all of the mechanisms of democratic power and democratic accountability that might be available to us. If one route to people power has been foreclosed by our courts or by our elected legislators, then we have to think about kicking in the doors of other routes. And so I hope that this presentation and discussion gives us some food for thought in that regard. And if nothing else, I hope that maybe it's a bit therapeutic in that it'll help us imagine what might be if we had a little more people power in the state of North Carolina. The second thing I want to acknowledge, which Anne already has, is that I'm not the only expert in this virtual room. We've had a team of Sanford School's Master of Public Policy students researching this topic all semester, working with the League of Women Voters of Orange, Durham, and Chatham. Two of those students, Laura Streitfeld and Peyton Barish, are on this call now. And so I'm not going to put them on the spot right now, but I might during question and answer session, because they've really been diving deeply into what other states are doing and looking specifically at the question of if there were to be a citizen initiative process in North Carolina, what sort of design considerations, how should it be structured, what best practices could be imported from other states, and have done some great work on that. My mandate, though, is a little broader, and so I'm going to share my screen now. And that mandate is first to talk a little bit broadly about what citizens initiatives are. There's a lot of terminology that we sometimes hear surrounding direct democracy, a lot of things to keep track of, in about 50 different flavors of what this looks like. So I just want to make sure we're all clear on what we're talking about. Then I'm going to briefly talk about the case for citizen initiatives, what the empirical evidence shows about their impact, and also just acknowledge some of the uneasiness that some people feel about this form of direct democracy and what the evidence shows about some of the negative consequences that might need to be mitigated. Then we'll look at North Carolina and just sort of remind ourselves of what the policy landscape looks like here. Spoiler alert, it's not particularly fertile ground for this kind of initiative right now. On the other hand, again, that's all the more reason perhaps that we should be thinking about whether it makes sense to focus more on this, to move the needle, to explore the possibilities. And then finally, we'll think a bit about what all of this means for where we might go from here, mostly in the form of a segue to our Q&A period. And so I encourage you, if you have questions, put them in the chat, and we'll get to as many of those as possible. I'm going to try to save as much time as I can for a free-flowing discussion. And if you want to talk about some of these other things that are going on in our state, which we're all very concerned about, then I'm happy to talk about those things too. But for now, I want to start just with this basic question of what do we mean when we say citizen initiatives? You sometimes hear about the idea of a ballot measure, sometimes called a ballot initiative, or sometimes a ballot question or a proposition. Goes by many forms, but what we're talking about here is the thing that is actually on your ballot when you go to the polls. It's a policy question, in other words, a form of enacting policy that is brought straight to the voters instead of being enacted by the legislature or through other policymaking processes. And many of the ballot measures that we're used to, especially in the state of North Carolina, come from the legislature, come through a process of legislative referendum, which every state in the country has in some shape or form. And so over the last decade, as North Carolina voters have considered different referenda for constitutional amendments, for bond issues, for other questions, all of those have had to come originate through our General Assembly, and for constitutional amendments with a pretty high threshold for getting on the ballot. That said, the other way, if you look around the country, that ballot measures get on the ballot is by citizen initiative, which is where we're going to focus today. And there are three main types of citizen initiatives. The first is a statute, so a change to a state's law. The second is a constitutional amendment. And the third is a popular referendum, sometimes called a veto referendum or a people's veto, which allows citizens to uphold or strike down a law that's already been passed instead of initiating a law or a constitutional amendment directly. We might say there's a fourth kind of citizen initiative, which is a recall election for elected officials. And I'm keeping those outside of the conversation today because we're focusing mostly on legislative or policy related initiatives. But many states also have those kind of recall initiatives. And I want to give just a little bit of history here, because while some of these forms of direct democracy may not always be familiar to us here in North Carolina, of course, they've got a long history, and it maybe goes without saying that the first form of democracy that there was a more direct democracy. In fact, the very word democracy means people power, and this idea that the people would come together to enact laws directly instead of electing representatives to do it on their behalf dates back to the Athenian democracy. Now, the conventional telling of American history holds that the constitutional framers were pretty skeptical, if not outright hostile, toward this kind of direct democracy. And I'm not going to dispute that narrative, since the legacy of their skepticism is so plainly evident in so many of the Republican structures they created, from the Senate to the Electoral College to the lifetime appointments of unelected Supreme Court justices. But I will complicate the narrative just a little bit, because forms of direct democracy existed on the American continent before the United States, including among some indigenous nations, but also in many of the American colonies, especially in New England. In fact, in 1775, a year before the signing of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson argued for a legislative referendum, not a citizen initiative, but a legislative referendum to be included in Virginia's state constitution. It was not included. The year later, delegates to Georgia's constitutional convention debated the same thing. And in 1778, again, before the federal constitution was drafted or ratified, Massachusetts became the first state to hold a statewide legislative referendum, which it used to ratify its state constitution. Even James Madison, who the father of the federal constitution, wrote in the Federalist Papers that when all else fails, essentially power should devolve back to the people. This sort of principle of the people being the source from which all power adheres.
A little more interesting.
I think there's one person who's not on mute. If you don't.
Just for a second. So the big donors, they want us to write.
So even James Madison, the sort of father of the Federal Republic, had at least some notion that there should be a role for people to play directly. That said, it wasn't until the end of the 19th century, about 100 years later, that forms of direct democracy began to spread across the country on a more widespread basis. And this was a really fascinating moment in American history, when not wholly unlike today, perhaps, when many people perceived government to be serving the interests of wealthy industrialists and increasingly impervious to the popular will. And in the face of this, you had this coalition of populist farmers and laborers, along with progressive reformers, who kind of came together to advocate for many of the sweeping changes we now associate with the progressive era, which included, of course, the secret ballot, women's suffrage, the first campaign finance regulations, direct primary elections, but also as one of its cornerstones included citizen initiative or referenda. So you see between 1900 and 1920, the vast majority of the states that now have these direct democracy processes in place adopted those through popular referenda to add them to their state constitution. Of course, saliently absent from this wave of progressive reform was much of the American South, where the one state party had largely taken hold following the abandonment of Reconstruction by the federal government in 1876, and where white supremacist elites, having witnessed what representative democracy actually looked like in their states, were not particularly eager to devolve more power to the people. So with a few exceptions in the latter half of the 20th century, this wave of progressive reforms gave us the landscape we see today, with 26 states providing for at least one form of citizen-initiated ballot measure. And while most states that have adopted initiatives and referenda have done so with broad public support, not every state has succeeded. During that early wave of adoption, voters in Texas and Wisconsin rejected the process. Minnesota has tried and failed 3 times to adopt it due to kind of the quirk in its state constitution that requires a majority of voters to approve constitutional amendments. And but if you look across the country today, you see in red and blue states, in just about every region of the country, some form of direct democracy existing. That said, the specific shape that these initiatives take varies widely from state to state, and how the process is designed is crucial to how much voice it actually gives to the people of the state. So if you think about all of the steps that must go into a ballot measure, first there's the question of how is it initiated, who's eligible, how many signatures on a petition do they need to collect, what kind of geographical scope is there for the collection of those signatures. Now we have this question of, can it be done online versus physically? The first states have begun to do purely online petition gathering. Then there's the scope of the measure itself. Is it one issue? Is it multiple issues? Access to the ballot, is it direct? In other words, once the requisite petitions have been gathered, does it automatically go to the ballot? Or does it need to go through the legislature or another body first for approval before it goes on to the ballot? There's some really devilish questions about wording, how the initiative or question is put to the people, where it's placed on the ballot. There's questions about the campaign, how long is it, what kind of campaign finance regulations should apply to it. And then if it is passed by the people, there's questions about the implementation. Is it implemented automatically, or must there be implementing legislation adopted by the legislature or issued by the executive branch? Finally, what kind of review or revocation period should there be? Can it be immediately overturned in the next election, or should there be a kind of cooling off period before any further changes are made? So these are all important questions, and we'll come back to these in a bit. These are exactly the type of questions that our team of students really looked into this semester. But for now, our main takeaways are: 1, that a majority of states have some form of citizen initiative process. 2, that the details of these processes vary widely from state to state. And 3, that these variations matter for how we might evaluate both the impact of citizen initiatives and their wisdom. So in whatever their shape, over the last 20 years, 120 years or so, this form of direct democracy has been used widely to decide all manner of policy questions, from adult entertainment and dueling laws to labor rights and affirmative action. According to Ballotpedia, since 1904, about 850 statewide ballot initiatives have been adopted out of around 2,000 that made it onto the ballot. But the reason we're here today is because citizen initiatives have received a whole lot more attention over the last decade or so, which is, again, another time of widespread perception that government is serving the interest of the select few and is unresponsive to the will of the people. In fact, in the last 3 even-year elections alone, nearly 150 statewide ballot measures received consideration. And this has produced some major victories in a range of policy areas, from raising the minimum wage to creating independent redistricting commissions, something I know the League cares a lot about, to, of course, securing abortion rights. It is also just a note on independent redistricting commissions, because I know that's something that's of interest. You know, you've seen some pretty major victories over the last decade in states like Michigan and Virginia, although Virginia perhaps less successful so far in creating these commissions through initiatives. And there's a whole lot of different flavors of independent redistricting commissions around the country, but there's a growing body of evidence that those are created with initiatives, through initiatives, have some real advantages in terms of their independence and autonomy relative to those created through other processes. So just kind of a side note on that issue. Because of this success, and not surprisingly, we're now in the midst of a growing backlash against these forms of direct democracy. In fact, in recent years, hundreds of bills to restrict the use of citizens' initiatives have been introduced and in some cases considered in states. In some states, like Arizona and Arkansas, conservatives have even sought to use the ballot measure process to weaken the ballot measure process, if you can get your mind around that. For the most part, voters aren't playing along, but some of the measures have been approved. And many of these efforts are coming to a head right as we speak, with Republicans seeking to preempt citizens from using the initiative process to protect abortion rights, especially in the wake of the Dobbs decision. And so I don't think it's an understatement to say that citizens' initiatives have become a key front in the battle for the future of American democracy. And for that reason, again, I think it's a pretty good time to be having this discussion, whatever's happening in North Carolina. So let me move, this is just actually a summary of the ballot measures introduced so far for 2024 by issue area. This may be a little outdated. I was surprised that reproductive rights was only 4%. But you see that a lot of these have to do with fiscal or social policy issues. Increasingly, however, you're seeing this tool used for issues of democracy and governance, including in this case, changes to the initiative process itself, but also other democracy-related issues, including redistricting. So a wide range of issues that are going to be on the ballot here next year as a result of these. So moving on to the pros and cons, the case for and against, and want to be clear here that I'm not that I have my own views on this, and I'm not trying to kind of both sides this issue, but we now have 120 years of experience with these initiatives, and I think we've learned a lot over those 120 years about both what their strengths are as well as what some of the risks are, and importantly, about how they can be designed to mitigate those risks. So there are four main arguments that are often used in favor of citizen initiatives that I want to talk about. The first is that they check the power of government. The second is that they increase voter turnout. The third is that they advance different forms of political equality. And then the fourth is that they actually transcend partisan polarization at this highly polarized moment. So I want to talk about each of these in turn. First, this idea that they check the power of government was in many ways the original rationale for them, right? This is this sort of populist moment in our history when people are rising up to say, we don't want to grant government so much power. We want to be more involved in these policy decisions. But their very presence has been shown to influence how legislators act. So one study found that states with citizen initiative processes are more likely to have adopted other governance reform measures, such as term limits or campaign finance regulations. Another study in Switzerland, which actually has a long history of direct democracy that was part of the inspiration for those reformers in the United States. Another study found that the initiation of ballot measures often led the legislature to take action on the issues that were going to be on the ballot to kind of preempt a citizen process in this. So there's always been this case that this is a way to check the power of government. But in the current era, I think we can also conceive of this check on government, not just in terms of preventing legislatures from doing bad things, but also in terms of circumventing the legislature when it refuses to take action on policies that have broad support. So I'm going to put here a map that the New York Times did, which took the referendum on abortion rights that occurred in Kansas last year. And this happened through legislative referendum, so it's not not an example of a citizens initiative. But the New York Times analyzed if the same sort of demographic and composition of the electorate that turned out to protect abortion rights in Kansas turned out in every state in the country, what are the states that would have voted the same way, that would have approved abortion rights or supported abortion rights? And they found that in every state but 7, a majority of voters would support that. Of course, you compare that to the abortion laws that are on the books that are increasingly sweeping the country, and you see just how disconnected this issue especially is from the popular will. And so this idea that citizens initiatives are kind of correctives to that disconnect, that bridge the gap between the public views on issues and what their policymakers are actually doing is still a pretty powerful notion today. Second, in terms of turnout, there's widespread evidence that initiatives and referenda increase voter turnout by between 3 and 8%, according to one review of the literature. And there's some debate over the mechanism for this. Is it a short-term kind of voter mobilization effect that depends on the issue and the ballot and the context of the election? Or is it more of a longer-term effect of what's called participatory momentum, bringing new people into the process and kind of keeping them there in the process once they're in, turning disengaged voters into engaged citizens? And the evidence is slightly stronger for the short-term explanation, but there's some evidence for both. And either way, there's virtually no question that ballot initiatives drive turnout, and that this effect is particularly pronounced the further you go down the ballot. So it's more pronounced in federal midterm elections than it is in presidential elections, and it's especially pronounced in local elections and some state elections as well. So that's increasing voter turnout. But in addition to increasing turnout overall, there's a lot of evidence that citizens initiatives also reduce political inequality by bringing underrepresented populations into the electorate and by producing a more representative policy outcome. So, for example, in 2022, the state of Michigan led the nation in youth turnout at about 37% turnout. And that's about 14 percentage points higher than in North Carolina. And there are a number of reasons why this might be. Michigan had just adopted some important voting reforms that made it easier for young voters to register in the turnout. But it's almost certain that the presence of an abortion initiative on the ballot was one of those reasons. In fact, young people polled about their priorities for this midterm overwhelmingly said that abortion rights were their top priority. And they were the only age group that said that. And anecdotally and increasingly empirically, there's a lot of evidence coming out that that was a huge motivating factor in bringing those young people into the midterm election in the state of Michigan. This makes sense intuitively, but other evidence also backs it up. One study of direct democracy in Sweden found that the introduction of local ballot initiatives not only increased women's turnout for those initiatives, but also increased their turnout in national elections and their participation in other political activities. So they became this kind of point of entry into the political system for underrepresented citizens. Another study found that American states with the most accessible initiative processes tend to weigh citizens' views more equally and also to produce more egalitarian policy outcomes. And that's a finding supported by comparative international research too. So it's not just that citizens initiatives bring new people into the electorate. It's also that the policy outcomes that are evident at the end of the process are more representative and less unequal than in other states. Finally, citizen initiatives can transcend partisan polarization in two important respects. First, the fact that they're not associated with parties or candidates, at least formally, tends to de-emphasize the party identification of voters and allow for cross-partisan coalitions of support at the ballot box and also in government. So this really interesting thing happened in Arkansas, where in 2018, Arkansas voters passed one of the nation's strongest minimum wage laws. And then Republicans in the Arkansas legislature tried to scale it back. And you actually had the Republican governor and the state Republican Party coming out and saying, no, we want to protect this. and sort of making a conservative case for the minimum wage that you have not heard in other states, right? So there's this idea of shifting the politics of these issues and breaking through this polarization that citizens initiatives hold the potential to do. The second way that they transcend polarization is that they give states an important policy tool at a time when the federal government is often stymied or gridlocked by polarization. So they become another pathway for action on those issues. Sorry, my light went off in my room, so I'm going to try to turn it back on real quick. All right. Finally, I just want to make one final point, an important argument in favor of citizens initiatives, is that a lot of these benefits, the evidence shows that they accrue regardless of whether an initiative is actually approved, right? If you think about mobilizing voters, bringing new people into the process, checking or at least threatening credibly to check the power of government, sure, you want initiatives to pass if you like what's in them, but even if they don't pass, a lot of these benefits are still evident in the states that have a robust and strong citizens initiative process. That said, as I foreshadowed, there are also some compelling arguments against them, or at least some cautionary notes about their adoption. And so I'm going to go through 4 of those really quickly. The first is the idea that they generate complexity and confusion for voters. Second is the idea that they destabilize policies and politics by creating a lot of uncertainty about what the policy landscape's going to be. The third is that they can be exploited by special interests, and this is a criticism we hear from both sides, both parties, frankly. And then fourth, and this is the big one, is the idea that they sort of impose the tyranny of the majority and might threaten minority rights in key areas. So just to go through these 4 concerns quickly. First, the idea that they generate confusion and complexity. Well, frankly, that argument sounds a little patronizing to me, but it's also not without any merit if you look at some of the ballot initiatives that people actually have to vote on. This is one that was on the Alaska ballot in 2014, and of course I will not read it or make you suffer through it, but it's an entire page of fairly complex legal language about this initiative relating to the oil and gas production task, right? So at a minimum, ballot initiatives do require a greater education campaign. They require voters to do a little more work to understand what's on the ballot. And over time, there have emerged a number of strategies that we might use to mitigate the complexity and the confusion that they might cause. So for example, limiting initiatives to one topic instead of multiple topics, imposing a word limit on the question, and requiring that it be phrased in as a yes/no question, with yes signaling change and no signaling the status quo, just so there's kind of an intuitive nature to it. So there are things we can do to mitigate this, but it is sometimes an issue with initiatives. Second, this idea of political instability. And this too has both a near-term and a long-term element. In the near term, the wording of ballot measures might occasionally create ambiguity or unintended consequences when it comes to their implementation. In the longer term, though, ballot measures might be overturned, right, by additional ballot measures. They might be superseded by new initiatives, or they might be sabotaged or overturned or constrained by state legislatures and executives in a way that creates a lot of policy uncertainty. Classic case here is kind of California, the epicenter of direct democracy, perhaps in the United States. But a more recent and salient example is in Florida, where you had this constitutional amendment to restore voting rights to people convicted of felonies pass in 2018. You then had the legislature, at the strong urging of Governor DeSantis, who, by the way, was elected that same year with a smaller margin than this amendment, right? So this is something with broad bipartisan support. But he comes to office, he encourages the legislature to sabotage it by requiring people to pay restitution and fees before they get their rights back. It gets caught up in the court, the Florida Supreme Court sides with DeSantis, and eventually the federal courts more or less sided with them as well, right? And this isn't necessarily an argument against them, right? These things often might end up in court. There might be efforts by other branches of government to sabotage them. That shouldn't be surprising, given that they're taking power away from those other branches of government. And so this isn't necessarily, to me, a compelling argument not to do them, but it is a compelling argument to think carefully about how we might create the conditions for a little more certainty. So one way that our Sanford team suggested doing that, which I think is a great idea, is by having some kind of waiting period, right? By saying you can't tinker with this for a couple of years at least. We need to give it a chance to take effect. And then if in the future, voters decide that they want something different, so be it, but let's give it some time to take effect first. Third, this idea of exploitation by special interests. This is a billboard. It's actually a local proposition, not a statewide one. This is a billboard from San Francisco a few years ago when there was a local initiative on the ballot that would have restricted short-term rental units, and it became this hugely divisive issue in the city. There we go. Airbnb spent $8 million on the initiative to try to defeat it. You can see that by this disclosure. And eventually they did defeat it, right? So it is certainly the case that special interests can participate in these campaigns, often can initiate them or oppose them. The evidence is a little mixed on just how much money matters on these ballot initiatives. There are certainly cases where a lot of money is being spent and initiatives don't pass. This is from an Illinois initiative in 2018, I think it was 2018, that would have amended the state's income tax to produce more revenue. You saw about 59 million spent against it and about 58 million spent in favor of it by this group called Vote Yes for Fairness. If you look at the donors to Vote Yes for Fairness, you see that there was one who happened to be the governor of Illinois, who spent $58 million of his own money on this ballot initiative, which did not end up passing. And, as progressives, we might be disappointed that that didn't pass, but we might also point out that a millionaire governor spending $58 million of his own money is maybe not exactly an example of citizen democracy or power or people power, right? So there are campaign finance considerations here, making sure that there's adequate transparency, disclosure, all of those good things before these things come out. Finally, in terms of tyranny of the majority, again, this is really the big one because there are clear examples throughout history of times when citizens' initiatives have had detrimental and sometimes harmful effects on the public good. And there are two main areas that are often cited as the kind of cautionary tale here. The first is when it comes to revenue. And the classic example here is California's Proposition 13, which was enacted in the late 1970s and essentially capped local property taxes in the state. And that had all kinds of different effects, including forcing the state to really raise the individual income tax and generate revenue from other sources, including immediately handicapping the efforts of local governments to meet their residents' social services. You saw spending on education decline over time. You saw home ownership decline over time, which is a little counterintuitive, but people weren't moving. They were staying in their houses, and so there was not adequate supply to meet market demand for new homes, and so home ownership went down. And so that's kind of the classic example, but there are many other examples, especially when it comes to taxes. North Carolina passed an income tax cap recently, in it that was overturned by the court. And Arizona, one of the initiatives that it did approve in 2022 was one that would require a higher vote threshold for any citizens initiative that involves raising taxes, right? No surprise, people don't like taxes, but this is something that's been exploited often by special interests to really hamstring the efforts of government to raise revenue. The other cautionary tale is in the area of civil rights. where there are plenty of examples where citizens initiatives have been used to enact policies that were discriminatory, sometimes racist. We have examples of that in this state, of course, through legislative referendum. If you look at HB1 in the last decade, if you look at voter ID laws that were also, once they were rejected by the courts, passed through citizens in it or through legislative referendum. But lest we think this is only a North Carolina problem, even in that progressive beacon of California, we've seen initiatives to ban same-sex marriage, to block affirmative action, to deny public benefits to immigrants, and a whole range of other policy issues that are probably concerning for progressives. Now, it's very hard to draw an overarching conclusion about whether citizen initiatives are kind of better or worse on balance for civil rights or for revenue, but it's certainly fair to say that they don't cut only in a progressive direction, and that once a state opens the door to them, the bad kind of comes with the good, and citizens and organizations better be ready to fight against the ones they don't like just as soon as they're ready to fight for the ones that they do like. So that's the basic case for and against. Want to talk for just a couple minutes about the landscape here in North Carolina, and then we'll segue to question and answers. I put this kind of hopeful question mark here, direct democracy in North Carolina, but most of us are probably aware that, that our state is one of the more restrictive states in the country, not just for direct democracy, but also when it comes to amending our Constitution in the first place. So there are essentially two pathways we can take. We can amend it through legislative referendum. That requires first that the legislature pass legislation to put it on the ballot with a 3/5 approval, right? So a higher threshold for approval. Once on the ballot, it doesn't require the governor's signature, and once on the ballot, if it's passed by a majority of voters, it takes effect. This has been used frequently throughout North Carolina history. Of course, I mentioned some of those recent examples, but we've also, our most recently approved amendments that were not struck down by courts involve the right to hunt and fish and victims' rights, right? So these are sometimes things used by legislators to kind of juice turnout on the ballot, but they're also sometimes things that, are used on important but not particularly controversial issues as well. The other pathway to amending our Constitution is by convention, and that requires first 2/3 approval by the chamber. Then the voters have to approve the convention referendum, calling the convention. Then voters have to approve the proposed amendments. And so it's little surprise then that we haven't had a convention in 150 years just about, and that we have adopted a new constitution since then in 1971, but that constitution was created not through a convention, but through the legislative referendum process. In other words, the legislature just approved it and put it on the ballot, and then the voters approved it. Now, there is a local initiative process in North Carolina, but it's extremely limited. First, local ordinances. There are cases where the General Assembly has granted local jurisdictions some limited power to enact local ordinances through popular referenda, but the General Assembly has to give them permission, like so much else in our state. And there's a statutory stipulation that those initiatives may not be used to levy new taxes, which is what a lot of local governments would probably most want to use that power for. But there is also a statutory power that allows local governments to adopt charter amendments through the local initiative process without having to kind of preemptively seek permission by the General Assembly. And usually these are fairly routine things like the name of a municipality, but they can also involve things like the size and type of its governing board, the terms of its members, how its members are elected, the districts. And so I actually think, if I'm searching for silver lining here, maybe there's some stones that we could turn looking for possibilities for some pro-democracy reforms using that charter amendment process. By and large, though, we're reliant on that legislative referendum process. And the fact of the matter is North Carolina has never voted on a citizens initiative process. It's never been brought to the people, either in that first wave of progressive reforms or since, and it's never even received a vote by the General Assembly. Our Sanford team did turn up this gem of a bill, which was introduced by Republican sponsors, including Tim Moore in 2009, to create a citizens initiative process. You might recall this is also the time when Republicans were arguing for independent redistricting commissions because they'd been frozen out of power for so long. It's easy to look back and wonder what if our leadership, the Democratic leadership, had been just a little more sympathetic to some of these initiatives. But the fact of the matter is the bill went nowhere, and I'm not totally sure if anything like this has been reintroduced since, but I'm not aware of anything, and a quick search did not turn up of anything. So where does that leave us? Where do we go from here? I'll close with just a couple of brief findings, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. First, this is a process that I think holds a lot of promise as a democratic tool that can check the power of government, increase turnout, advance political equality, and transcend polarization at a really polarized time. That said, it also carries risks to governance, to minority rights, and those risks must be mitigated through careful design and implementation. Not all citizen initiatives are the same, and we have a pretty good sample size now to know which ones work and which ones don't. The majority of states do allow some form of citizen initiative. Should say the District of Columbia also does. No state has adopted this tool since the early 1970s, and of course, some states are now restricting the practice. We've not had a state totally repeal it or try to totally repeal it, but we have seen again in Arizona and Arkansas and elsewhere some ballot measures to weaken ballot measures, in addition to legislatures raising a lot of roadblocks, like Ohio right now thinking about lifting the vote threshold for constitutional amendments, and other states doing similar things. On the surface, it does not appear to be fertile ground in North Carolina, maybe stating the obvious, for citizen initiatives. And that's because the bar for amending our state constitution is pretty high relative to some states, and because we've never considered a proposal to establish an initiative or referendum process. But to finish where we started, given the current misalignment between political outcomes and the popular will, maybe now's the time to revisit the idea, or at least to ask ourselves, should this be something that we are incorporating into our advocacy agenda, that we're working with like-minded legislators to at least introduce and raise the profile of, and maybe shift the public debate around, so that sometime in the future, the incentives start to change and the path to a direct democracy process in North Carolina looks a little clearer. And so I'll close just with my bottom line, which I draw on Jane Addams for, which is that in most cases, the cure for what ails us in a democracy is more democracy. I think there are some real risks here that need to be thought through. But if we trust that over time, by bringing questions like this to the people, and when I say the people, I mean all the people, a representative electorate, then we have to have faith that they'll make the right decision over time, and that if they make some mistakes, that there'll be an opportunity to correct those mistakes. And so I think on balance, it's a powerful tool, but that's something we can talk about. So let me stop there and go to questions, and I'm going to unshare my screen just so I can see more of you.
Hey, well, thank you so much, Asher. Please join me in a virtual round of applause. Great job. Asher, you've certainly presented us with a lot to think about. It was a clear and enlightening presentation. I think you raised some very good points on the pros, but also the cons. We have some questions in the chat. The first one is, do you know how much interest there might be currently in North Carolina to pursue citizen initiatives beyond our league?
Well, I was going to say, the fact that your league is having this talk tells me there's some interest, right? You're at the forefront of, of a lot of these debates. I don't know. I haven't seen any polling or anything like that that would give me a clear indication. But I do know that, again, in almost every state that has enacted these, they've been enacted with fairly broad, wide margins. Shouldn't surprise us. Voters like having more power, right? And that the hurdle in most places is not, that don't have them, is not the popular will. It's not the majority will. It's the current elected officials and institutions that are standing in the way. And so I'd love to see some more granular, public opinion research and other research on sort of what people think about this in North Carolina. I hope that there are more people talking about it now, but I just don't know how much interest there is.
Okay. Another question is, do you know exactly how Wisconsin used the process to establish?
Yeah, Jim, maybe restate your question off mute if you can, just to make clear what you're asking about.
Am I on mute?
No, I was asking
Yeah,
Jim.
I'm not sure
No.
I understand this one.
Well, I can maybe answer this in part by saying Wisconsin's actually, let me see, hold on a minute. I'm just going to go back here. Wisconsin's actually one of those states that does not have an initiative process. It did vote on one in that progressive wave in like 1914 or 1915, but it didn't pass. And as far as I know, it hasn't again. Of course, Wisconsin, like North Carolina, is a bit of a poster child for extreme gerrymandering through the legislature. But as I understand it, a lot of the debate sort of surrounding that in Wisconsin has been through the courts and not through, not through any kind of citizen initiative process. So that's the best I can do. But whoever asked that question, feel free to follow up with me if I didn't get to it like you wanted.
Asher, in the states where citizen initiatives are in effect, did they generally require constitutional amendments for enactment? Is that a
Yeah.
fairly universal provision across the country?
Yes, and in most cases, they were, I don't know this for a fact, but in most cases during the progressive era, at least, they were enacted through a referendum. In other words, they held a legislative referendum to establish a citizen initiative process. So the state legislature put it on the ballot as a constitutional amendment, and then the citizens approved that, again, in most cases, with a few exceptions. It's a good question whether there are any states where citizens initiatives were kind of written into the Constitution through a convention or through another means, but I don't think there are any where they were achieved through statute. Laura or Peyton, did you encounter that at all in your research? They might not be on, so if we don't hear from them, we'll go on to the next.
Oh, I'm on. I didn't hear anything about that. I think, without looking back, I think they were all established by a constitutional amendment, but I would have to check that.
Great.
And then we've got another one from Anne asking, if we were able to have citizen initiatives in North Carolina, what do you think would be at the top of the agenda for citizens?
Well, I'm curious to know what you think, but my basic answer is that it's probably the issue that's top of mind for all of us right now after the last 2 days in Raleigh. It's really, there is wide public support for the protecting the status quo on abortion rights in North Carolina. And it seems pretty clear that this ban that has moved through the General Assembly is out of step with that. So that's my answer, but I'm curious to know if others of you have different answers too.
Well, one I know that people are interested in is the minimum wage and the fact that we're still in the cellar on the minimum wage.
Yeah, and if Arkansas can do it and Missouri can do it, then we should
Right.
be able to do it too, right?
Right.
And of course, independent redistricting. I mean, as you all are probably aware, North Carolina came a lot closer than many people realized to the legislature, came a lot closer than many people realized to putting a legislative referendum on independent redistricting on the ballot in 2020 before the pandemic hit and everything kind of shut down. And then, of course, Republicans won. They didn't feel the need to reform. But that's another one that I think there would be a lot of interest in. And because of that, probably given recent developments, yet another reason why it would be a really heavy lift for the state.
We have a question about New York, major New York City. I'm not sure I quite understand it. Dave Sider, do you want to ask the question?
Oh, no, I think the question's about charter, what's the strongest charter amendments? And actually, I think that's a really good question that we should look into more. I'm just not very familiar with the charter amendment process. I know that the statute that grants municipalities that authority does impose some parameters to what they can do. For example, on election districts, they have to be single member districts. Otherwise, my initial thought was, could we do ranked choice voting or something at the local level? And it looks like, and I think most of the groups who are involved in that debate agree that, the basic answer is not quite. But I think we should look more into that, and there might be some, short of this, right? There might be some sort of pro-democracy reforms that could be achieved through the local level, especially in municipalities that haven't reformed their charters in a very long time and might have some outdated practices there.
Mm-hmm. Is one of the risks you speak of the threshold needed to place an initiative on the ballot?
Yes, and certainly I think that the balance is you want to make it accessible without inviting frivolous or potentially harmful initiatives, right? I actually like to bring Laura and or Peyton in again there just to see if they made any recommendations around that particular question of the signature threshold, or sort of what they found when they looked around the country on that.
Yeah, so a bunch of the experts that we talked to gave us a sweet spot of 8% of the last votes in the most recent gubernatorial election. However, one of the considerations that we made pretty clear in our presentation was that because of the difference in overturning constitutional and statutory amendments, when you are trying to institute one or the other onto the ballot, the signature requirement should probably be a little bit higher for constitutional amendments versus statutory initiatives, just based on how hard it might be to overturn. And like Asher sort of talked about, Prop 8 in California is a really great example of that. Something that, has sort of backfired once it was passed. And that sort of thing is harder to overturn if you put that on into the North Carolina Constitution rather than just as a statutory initiative.
Yeah. Thanks, Peyton. Then there's one on Asher on how do you think the voter ID requirement will impact who can vote on starting the process? Do you think that would have much of an impact?
Well, I'm very disappointed in the voter ID ruling, and I think it could have an impact on a lot of things. I'm not totally sure, Amy, that I understand exactly the connection you're making to this process. For North Carolina to do it, of course, we would need our legislature to put it on the ballot, and then to vote there. And like any other election, voter ID could have some impact on the electorate that, that kind of comes out for that. But I don't think there's like a unique impact that voter ID would have on an election on this issue relative to any others. That said, a citizen initiative process would be a good chance to maybe get some more permanent solution on voter ID, which has now been 10 years in the making of courts and legislature and popular initiative. On the other hand, that's a great example of an issue that majorities of the public have pretty consistently supported voter IDs, right? And there are plenty of states that have them. And so that's another one of those kind of be careful what you ask for issues, because as we saw in North Carolina, you bring that question to the people, and in many cases, they're going to say, yeah, it makes sense to have a voter ID. And so that's kind of one of the risks that we take.
And then we have, maybe this is a good final question here. Does the League of Women Voters of North Carolina have a position in favor of this, or would we need to study it? I don't believe there is a position at this point. Is that correct, Jennifer?
No, there's not a position directly about citizens initiatives, but this is kind of the beginning of the process, and we're hopeful that with this study and we're bringing it to league members at the convention, and we're having a Zoom before convention, so anyone who is not going to the convention can tune in and hear more about it. But this is it's a process of study, but I think there's a lot of interest, and so we'd like to feed that interest.
Right. In fact, we're going to have a caucus at the state convention in a couple of weeks, using the information we've gleaned from the student report, from Asher's presentation tonight, to introduce league members from around the state to the concept, discuss it, and see if there is interest in pursuing this issue. I'd love to hear, before you sign off, if you want to put some comments in the chat as to whether you think this is fertile ground for us to study and pursue. We'd certainly appreciate the input. And someone just said, so the study begins. So looks like we may have volunteers to work on the issue. Well, I really want to thank Asher. I also want to thank Peyton and Laura, 2 of the 3 students who worked so hard on an excellent report. And that report will be available on our website, as Anne indicated in the introduction. So you can read it at your leisure. It's excellent overview. Asher's recording will be on if you want to listen again. There was a lot of terrific information. And feel free to email us and let us know what you think and whether you would volunteer to be on a study committee on this topic if we move forward. And with that, I will thank everyone for coming and look forward to the work ahead.
Thanks, everybody. Feel free to follow up with my contact information if you want to continue the conversation. Good luck out there.
Thank you so much, Asher. Thank you. It was great.
Thank you so much.